somebody opens the door, a lot of people will consider the consequences while I'm walking through the door.
Whoa.
And take the consequences, whatever they might be.
This is Mark Husey with internationally recognized author, lecturer, composer, and recitalist, and soon-to-be centenarian, Dr. Orpha Ochse, in this video interview for the Oral History Project of the Oregon Historical Society here in Dr. Ochse's home in Claremont, California, Tuesday, November 12th, 2025. Dr. Ochse, thanks so much for seeing us today. It's an honor to interview you.
My pleasure.
Saw your name all over the place when I was in school, and all my teachers knew you. And it's just real exciting. So let's begin from the beginning. You're born in 1925 and raised in St. Joseph, Missouri.
Correct.
Want to tell us about your seminal musical experience and your first musical memories and what drew you to the organ?
I started music lessons when I was 5 years old because I was too young to enter the kindergarten in the St. Joseph schools. So my mother, who was probably anxious to get me out of the house for a few hours a day, enrolled me in a music kindergarten where I learned the names of the notes and where they were located on the piano. And we associated the notes of the scale with birds of different colors. The red bird lived in the C house, and his name was Doe. And the orange bird lived in the D house, and his name was Ray, and so on.
That's incredible.
So I learned all these birds and got to color them too while we were in the process. And I thought that the alphabet began on Do and ended on T, or the pink bird. And it was a surprise to me to find all those other letters that they had after G that you had to learn without any musical background.
That's amazing. Tell me what drew you to the organ specifically.
Specifically in the organ, well, I was a keyboardist then from year one and had a few lessons on the church organ, which was that Henner's Albertson Tracker organ from the church organist, Edna Michelle. And she was not an organ teacher as a profession. And she used the old Stainer book that had funny pictures of men in long boots. Anyway, I had at least an introduction to the organ at that time. And when I went to college, a relative of mine said she would pay for a semester of organ lessons if I wanted to take them. And I said, okay, didn't matter to me. So I signed up for a semester of organ lessons, among other things.
At Swinney Conservatory at Central Methodist College?
At Central Methodist College at that time was called Central College. Today it's Central Methodist University. The organ teacher there was Luther Spade, and he was an excellent teacher. And by the end of the first semester, I had changed my major from a music major to more specifically an organ major. So I was hooked very early on in my college career.
Would you say that was your first time surrounded by other serious musicians?
Yes, I would say
And
so.
what was that like?
Well, I ate it up because I not only was taking all the courses in the Swinton Conservatory, I was playing trombone in the band and violin second section in the orchestra and singing in the chorus.
That's fantastic.
So it was nonstop for me.
Tell us about the transition from Swinton Conservatory to Eastman and your work with Dr. Gleason.
Well, in the first place, it was a cultural shock to move out of the Midwest and into the Northeast. The climate was the first hang up. And the expectations were entirely different from what they were in a small liberal arts college. The Gleasons were highly organized, and you went through the list of works in the back of the Gleason method, and no matter how advanced you were, you still used the Gleason method book because everybody practiced the pedal and manual scales, and they were on the semester exams every time. So it was much more regimented and much more demanding than anything I'd experienced. I went to Eastman as a music theory major, principally because studying the catalog, I defined that one could do a theory major master's degree in 1 year, but it was surely going to take 2 years for an organ major. So, being the practical soul I was, I opted for the theory degree, and I liked theory very much. Taught it many years.
Yeah. You then returned to teach at Central College, so you went back to your roots as a
I did.
And you taught Robert Clark.
Yes. He was a freshman in my first year of teaching there. And I was teaching part of the organ students and first year music theory. And Robert Clark was in my music theory class, and I suspected that he was doing the homework for 90% of the class, which he later confessed to, and I said, I thought it was good practice for you.
That's a good segue to this next question. What was surprising to you about or remarkable about moving from a student role to a teacher?
Well, it was, I think, a gradual process because all the time in high school, I had piano students at 25 cents an hour.
Oh, my goodness. That's I should say. So when were you back in, because I'm trying to connect the dots between being at Western Illinois State and also back at Central, and then you moved to California in 1957?
Yes, but in between there, I was in Phoenix from 1952 to 1957.
Oh, wow. What was that like?
That was a community college, and it was, of course, just a 2-year college. There was not a great deal musical going on in Phoenix.
It was a pretty young, smaller town, I would imagine.
Yes, it was.
And what was the organ culture like?
Very exciting because it was the first time I'd been in the West, and there was so much to see and so much to learn about the Indian cultures and just life in the West. I had a good friend on the faculty there who was a historian of Western culture, and she and I made many trips out into the desert to see various parts of it. But at the same time, before I left Eastman, I talked with Harold Gleason about who on the West Coast might be a good organ teacher. And his first suggestion was Clarence Mader. And he said, go take a few lessons from Clarence Mader, and if you don't like it, then try one of these other people. He gave me a list of several. So I finished my doctorate during the summer session and immediately went to Los Angeles and had a little chat with Clarence Mader about whether he'd accept a student who was going to come from Phoenix, which is about 400 miles, once a month. And he agreed to that. And I remained his student for a good many years.
What was the drawing card that brought you to the LA area? Was it the Congregational Church in Pasadena or California Institute of Technology? Or what was the drawing card that had you move here?
It was that there was so much going on in the organ world in the Los Angeles area. And of course, I kept going over there from Phoenix every month. And I thought, well, this is dumb.
Did you have your lessons at Emmanuel?
Yes.
And how many organs were at Emmanuel when you had your lessons?
How many what?
There were currently there are 3 organs at Emmanuel.
There are.
That are not used. How many were there when you had your lessons?
The only one that I had my lessons on initially was the organ in the sanctuary.
D.M. Skinner,
Yeah.
With Clarence Mader.
But during that time, the chapel organ was put in by Schlicker, and I probably had a lesson or two on that, but mostly it was the sanctuary organ. Well, you asked about whether the Congregational Church or Caltech threw me there. No, I arrived first and invaded that territory.
So you were very much a pioneer when you came here.
Yes, I started out with some very small church jobs that I heard about or somebody told me about, and changed jobs every month or so until the First Congregational Church position opened up. And that was a more substantial arrangement.
Wow.
Where I had the choirs and the organ and the whole scene.
And then I see here that you started at Whittier College in 1969. So eventually you got yourself into a permanent college teaching position.
Yes.
What was that trajectory like going into Whittier College like that?
Well, what came in between was that I taught on the World Campus Afloat semester at sea that was at that time sponsored by Chapman College. And the way it happened, one of the deans from Chapman College came to the Congregational Church in Pasadena to give a talk for the some people that were interested, he thought, in coming to their World Campus
at
Afloat.
sea.
Yes.
That's the first. Wow.
So this man was giving a talk, and he, in the talk, said, I taught the art class on this ship, and I tried to relate the art class lessons to the voyage, so that if we were going to a certain city, I'd tell them about what art they might find there. And
what were some of your ports of call? What were some of your ports of call?
Well, this wasn't my voyage.
Okay.
He was talking about his voyage.
Right, that's what he did, yeah. But
And that's when the light bulb went off. So I went up to him afterwards and said, who teaches the music course that follows the voyage?
Uh-huh.
And he responded, who could do that? And I said, I could.
Uh-huh.
So, sure enough, I was given the position of music teacher on the World Campus Float during the spring semester of 1968. So I had to learn a lot about music in other countries that I had no idea about. We left Los Angeles in January, and the voyage terminated in May in New York. And we had been all the way around South America, in parts of Africa.
Oh my goodness.
And all the way through the Mediterranean to Istanbul. And back, we'd gone on the south shore of the Mediterranean going in. And we came back on the north shore of the Mediterranean and made some stops in Europe and finally got to New York in May.
Incredible. Wow.
Do you want me to go on?
It's your interview. This is fascinating. You were totally off menu now, which I'm loving. So please go on.
But even before that, I had had a grant from the American Philosophical Society to do a comparative study of old organs in Europe. And I had spent some months going around with a Kudelski tape recorder, recording a specific group of examples that showed the various choruses and so on that I had selected.
And this is back in 68.
This was before 68. This was in the 50s. So
wow. So this predates your cruise then?
And by the time I was through with this study of European organs, the thought occurred to me, why am I doing all this in Europe? Why am I not studying the organs where I know the language and can get into all the libraries and so on? So I came home with that idea. Anyway, at the end of the voyage on the World Campus Afloat, I wanted to find out something about the New England organs. The tracker had not had very many years of publication, but I must have signed up for it because I knew about the tracker. And I knew about Barbara Owen. Someplace I got her telephone number. So I called her up and said, I'm this organist from the West Coast, and I want to know about Boston organs. Could you help me out? And she said, of course. And said, meet me at my church. So I met her at her church, and we spent a wonderful a Sunday afternoon going around to all the organs. She knew how to get into every instrument and where the doors were and how you turned it on, where the organist hit the key. So by the time we got back to her place, and she'd heard about my grant that I'd done with the American Philosophical Society, she said, "You better stay all night because we got a lot to talk about." And that was the first time I recognized that if you're going to go to New England and look at organs, you better bring your toothbrush. Anyway. So Barbara said, "Well, you better meet Alan Loftman and Ed Bodway." I'd never heard of either one of them. But she gave me directions to whatever little town that was where they taught, I guess, a boys' school. Yeah. And I found them at this school in a kind of assembly room, and they were sitting there stuffing AGO envelopes with notices of the next meeting. Well, I was very much at home with that, so I sat down and started stuffing envelopes too. And we had this wonderful talk. I told them I had bought a secondhand car and I was going to tour the United States looking at old organs. Did they have any suggestions? Well, did they ever have suggestions?
Wow. Give me the date for that again. When was this again? I'm trying to get a
This was at the end of the voyage. This was in 1968.
Okay. So did you have your 67 Chevy then?
No, the car I bought for about $200 was a Nash Rambler.
Wow.
And it was a very good car for this purpose because the seats would fold down and make a bed. So I bought a sleeping bag, and Ed Bodway and Alan Loftman loaded me up with all the back issues of the Tracker I didn't have, and all the issues of the Boston Organ Club newsletter I'd never heard of. That was a treasure trove of information. And also a list of places to go and look at old organs or find out if they were there. So I started out in this Nash Rambler, loaded up with all this information. Oh, by the way, they said, "We've got a lot to talk about. You better stay all night."
So, the toothbrush comes in handy.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Wow. This seems like a good insert for this with your networking with organists back in the day. What do you think? What kind of personality is drawn to the organ and organ culture, organ music? What kind of personality do you think?
Well, all the ones I met were very enthusiastic about helping each other. They were amazed that somebody from California even knew there was a Tracker organ.
Okay.
And so I was a sort of innovation, you might say. But most generous in helping you along, and it was so much different from the kind of reception one might expect in Europe when they're going around looking at organs.
That was another question as far as what were some of the differences in organ culture between Europe and the States.
Well, I think a great deal of it was just that you're a part of the culture, and that made a big difference. You knew people that they knew, and they knew the Eastman school at least. There were just more ties.
Well, let's get into your academic and compositional work. When did you start composing?
I have no idea. All the time that I had a church job, if the choir needed an introit for something, you just sit down and write it out. There wasn't any specific time. Of course, I took composition courses in college.
And you were a theory teacher, so.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about your work at Whittier. You taught Linda West Brown?
Yes, I had been at Whittier just as an organ teacher to fill in for Bob Pritchard, who took a semester off or something. So I already had a foot in the door there. This was before they had an organ at the college. And Pritchard was instrumental in getting a Schlicker organ put in there. But he went on to teach at Occidental College, and that left the organ position vacant. And when I came back from this big trip, the first thing I did was check in with Clarence Mader and say I was back and all in one piece. And he said, "Have you talked to Margaretha Lohman, the chair of the music department at Whittier?" And I said, "No." "Well," he said, "you better give her a call. She's been looking for you."
Oh.
So I called her up and she said, "We need somebody to teach organ starting in January." This was in, about Thanksgiving time when I finally got back to the West Coast. And by the way, our theory teacher wants to take a sabbatical. Do you know how to teach theory? "Oh, sure," I said. I was agreeing to anything at that time because I spent my last shekel and lectured myself across the country saying anything that has a dollar sign you will do.
Well, yeah.
So anyway, she needed a theory teacher and an organ teacher, and I said, "Do you need a composition teacher?" "Yes." "Well, they did need that." And I said, "Well, I can do that too." So that's when I got in the field of composition.
But they had all that waiting for you.
That's a long story.
That's fantastic. This is all a wind up to, I guess, what I would consider the way that I knew you before I met you. Your magnum opus of the history of the organ of the United States. And what was your tipping point for creating this? What was the impetus? And how did you just wind up to that and then you did it? Tell us about that.
Well, it was this idea that if I was going to study anybody's organs, it ought to be the American organs. And I had that idea in mind when I was meeting these New England organists, but I wasn't telling them. It was just an idea, and I thought they might be less generous with their
if they
materials if they knew they had a competitor. Anyway, all the way across the country on that trip, and I zigzagged back and forth, I was collecting information about this. I was stopping at libraries that might have local history and trying to find out what the important instruments to the people around there were. And I had some of these leads from Alan Loftman. He said, stop at the Tums factory in St. Louis because they're supposed to have a Tracker organ there.
At the Tums factory.
At the Tums factory.
Nobody saw that coming. Okay.
Well, that's a whole nother story. Actually,
I mean, this is the time for that. I mean, you want.
Well, when I knocked at the door and the girl opened the little peephole to the factory, and I said, I'm here to see the organ at the Tums factory. And you could see this question mark above her head. And she said, wait a minute, I'll call somebody. So she came back and said, come inside. I think I may have found somebody that knows something about this. Turns out one of the executives of the Tums factory had a son who was interested in Tracker organs and had bought an old organ and had stored it on the fourth floor of the Tums factory above some shelves.
Oh.
You couldn't tell anything about it except you could see a wind chest. You could see that there was something to do with an organ up there.
So it was not assembled.
It was not assembled.
Oh, dear.
But I got a full-scale tour of the Tums factory and a year's supply, I'm sure it was,
Oh, my goodness.
of every flavor of Tums, which was sometimes very useful.
I'm sure. Wow.
But another place Alan Loftman sent me to was the Hershey factory in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And the first thing I found out was that you didn't need directions to the Hershey factory because you could smell it.
Follow your nose.
You've been there.
It's wonderful.
You could smell it from miles out. And they did have a Tracker organ, a little assembly room of some sort.
In the Hershey factory?
Yeah.
Wow.
But they didn't give me a live supply of Hershey bars.
Oh, no.
In fact, I don't think they offered me any.
Oh, no. Goodness. Wow. So, the question is, what do you think the legacy of the history of the organ in the United States is? I know what I think about it. I know how thankful I am to you for it. But what do you think, or what is your aspiration for its legacy, or just what do you?
Well, I think that there's no one style you can point to that's best. We have such diverse uses of the organ, and the churches are so different. It's not like you had mostly Lutheran churches or mostly Catholic churches. Ours are mostly whatever.
Well, especially in the past, it's going to turn 50 next year.
Yeah.
That book. So what are your? I mean, this is a.
Well, I think
the last 50 years since the book was written.
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on that?
There was such a push to get Tracker organs in every place, and I don't think that's particularly appropriate. But I think it's the type of organ you would want to have in your church to play on every Sunday. But if you're in a church where the choirs are diverse and you need a different kind of music than was originally intended for just the organ, then you better have a more diverse organ.
I know at the Yale Divinity School they have the Charles Krigbaum tracker organ in the balcony. They have a Hammond B3 in the front. But and there's so many different kinds of trackers you could have.
Yes, well, of course, the tracker idea was just coming in at the time I wrote that book, and there weren't very many in America. It'd be a whole different story now. And somebody needs to write something about that 50 years and go back and correct anything I got wrong in the first 200 years.
You certainly laid the groundwork. I doubt there are many corrections. Tell me about how you think the OHS has changed since you joined, and what your aspirations for the future of the Oregon Historical Society.
Oh, well, it's changed so much. The very first convention I went to was in Reading, Pennsylvania. And we went around we carpooled to get from one church to the next. And it was very casual. I had a good friend in Reading. His name was Charles Lutz. And he knew about this convention, and I was visiting him, suggested that we go to it. And we go to these little churches out in the boonies. You needed some kind of a guide to find your way to them. And there would be a lunch provided by the ladies. And Charles had a scale about how good the lunch was going to be. He said it depends on the size of the aprons that these ladies are wearing. He said, now you watch, if you go in a church where the ladies have pretty little dainty scarves for an apron, you are not going to get much of a lunch. But if you go in one where they've got a full apron with a bib and all that, it's going to be a feast. So that was my first OHS convention.
Wow.
But he and I had gone on some trips around that Pennsylvania Dutch area looking at organs, and that was a very rich area, I think.
What are some of your other fond...
And it was all new to me.
Oh, wow. What are some of your other fond memories of OHS members, founders, or conventions?
I like those conventions where some of the Australians came. Do you remember there were 2 or 3 Australian organists that came to some of the conventions, and they had a different perspective about everything. And I was interested enough in their viewpoint that I went to Sydney and visited their organs.
Oh, wow. When did you go to Sydney? When did you go to Sydney?
I don't remember.
But you did.
I was there a couple of times.
Oh, wow. Well, so tell me about the town. I guess you played the town hall organ and maybe St. James before the Dobson got out there. Or what were some of the organs you played in Sydney?
Well, we went around to see the
organ.
Now, I can't even remember his name now.
I can see. I know of a prominent Sydney organist, and I will think of it because was he the organist at St. James in Sydney? David Drury?
No, it was Drury's friend that I was.
David Drury's friend. Okay.
Who was taking me around. And I had met Drury, yes. But this man was another one who knew how to get into things.
That's fantastic. You have other publications as far as with Schoenstein in Austin. You have an Austin organ book?
The Austin organ book is the biggest one. That is the fattest.
They were the last surviving builder of the grand period of American organ building.
And Jack Bethards sent me on that trail after the Austin book was my third book. The second one was the 19th century French
and
Belgian book.
Tell me about that book.
That was great fun.
I can tell.
I loved doing that because in the first place it was the best excuse in the world to spend a month in Paris and a month in London.
Oh.
Which I did.
So were some highlights?
Quite a lot of times.
What were some highlights of that? Organs, venues?
About that book?
The book you're preparing for, your research for it. Memorable.
Well, I started on the French book because I was puzzled. I thought I was going to write a book about French organ music of the first half of the 19th century.
Oh.
Because we didn't know anything about it. We knew all this stuff that came in the second half, the Franc, the Vidor, and the Guillemot, but we didn't know anything about the music of the early part of the 19th century. So I started getting acquainted with that. And by the time I'd wasted months, I thought, well, the reason we don't know it is that there's none of it that you want to know.
Wow.
With the possible exception of some of the preludes and fugues of Boele.
Oh.
He was the only. The rest of it was trash. And so I wasted all that time.
Oh, dear.
And I thought, how did that happen? So that started the book then. How did that happen? That all of a sudden, the second half, they're the place that every organist wants to go. And there's nothing the first half.
Maybe they recovered from the Revolution. The Napoleonic Wars.
It was.
Yeah.
The Revolution just absolutely shut down the church and organ business.
Yeah. Put the church on pause.
And the only way those organists could survive in the first half of the century was to put on these big patriotic mega festivals and write music that was going to appeal to the very lowest musical imagination there was. And they saved a lot of organs that way, just by complying. They were under attack. Well, the church was. They were all church property became government property. And so anyway, that was an exciting story to find out about.
Bravo. Tell me about your California works, Manuel Rosales and the Los Angeles Organ Renaissance. That's a Barbara Owen. Talk a little bit about the impact that Barbara Owen had on your organ scholarship. You mentioned her earlier when you first met back in the...
Oh, well, I think her books were landmarks. And her knowledge of the early history of the organ. I don't think anybody could equal it. And she was a good friend and a good sport. We always enjoyed each other, and I was very saddened that she came to the end of her life before I did. As usual, she was in front of me.
You really embraced your Californian identity.
Mm-hmm.
And how has that impacted your, embracing your California identity? How's that affected your work?
Well, I moved here or moved to Southern California because it was such a lively organ culture. And at the time I moved here, the Pasadena chapter was the liveliest of all.
Really?
Surpassing, I thought, the Los Angeles chapter. There were so many people in the Pasadena chapter that were performers and not just members. Bob Pritchard was one, Charles Schaefer was another one, and just it seemed to me that everybody was drawn to that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And then we put on a National AGO convention sponsored by the Los Angeles, the Pasadena, and the Long Beach chapters. And this brought a vast number of organists together, because each committee for this convention had members from each of the three chapters. Mm-hmm. And we thought we put on a splendid
What
convention.
Year was that?
I don't remember. I've got the...
But Clarence Mader was a part of that, I guess. Clarence Mader would have been a part of that then?
Yes, he was the program chair.
Wow.
It took some arm twisting to bring that about, I might say.
No, go ahead.
But I was the arm twister in that case.
Good. This is not on my menu, and at the risk of embarrassing myself, I'm going to take it out and edit. But because of your Mader association, did you know the Craigheads?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I met David Craighead before he went to Eastman.
Really?
Yeah.
And he was still out here.
He was still out here. And he and the Maders were very close. And they had the Craigheads and me over so that we could talk over what Eastman was like, since I'm the one that had been there. And every time I was in Rochester after that, I visited the Craigheads. Wonderful people.
Yeah. Big Eastman legacy. It's a great one.
Well, talking about this tri-chapter business, one of the things that happened was that we thought we were as powerful as the New York chapter, and we wanted to get a little more clout. The head chair of the convention we put on was Gene Driscoll. Don't know is that name familiar to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Gene Driscoll was a funeral home organist, but he was an excellent manager. And at the end of the conventions, we put his name up to be a member of the AGO National Council. Nobody outside the New York area had ever been on the AGO Council up till this time.
Wow.
And we did advertising for him all through the Midwest and every place we could think of, and the Boston chapter, who got a big kick out of this and decided they were going to do the same thing. And we got Gene elected as the first counselor outside the New York area.
Bravo.
And that's where Barbara and some of her friends said, we're going to do that too.
Oh.
And after that, several, it was me included, were on the National Council for a while. It was kind of fun.
When were you on the National Council?
I don't remember.
That's fine too. You want to talk about your music theory book with James Duncan? Fundamentals of Music Theory, 2006. So you wrote that when you were 78-ish? Did I get that right? That's incredible to me.
Well, I had gone to some meeting where somebody had talked about this idea of a kind of self-instruction book. And Jimmy Duncan was from the Swinney Conservatory.
That's where the Swinney connection is. Okay.
Yeah. And he and I were undergraduates together.
Oh. Wow.
And were members of the same groups. Anyway, he and I decided we could do that kind of book of self-instruction with tests included in the book and that sort of thing for music fundamentals. It wasn't really the theory level, but rather as
the fundamentals.
Fundamentals,
which you had since you were 5 years old.
Yeah,
in a specialized school. But the music lessons you had at 5 years old, any urban person would be envious of that.
Yeah, I don't know where that teacher got her ideas about these birds. And by the way, the birds went around the color wheel.
Oh,
so I learned the color wheel.
Wow.
When I was in kindergarten. And when I started art classes here at the Gardens, after I retired, I tried to explain to the art teacher how the color wheel was associated with these birds in the music business.
For the circle of fifths?
She sort of went off.
Wow.
Because the primary colors are the C major chord if you translate it to birds.
Wow.
And anyway.
That's brilliant. That's a beautiful full circle moment I'm seeing as far as from your elemental experience. So in retirement, you've continued performing and advocating for American organs, and you've taken up painting.
I did what?
You've taken up painting since you moved here?
Yes. These are all mine.
Oh, my goodness. Oh. Okay, that's... Oh. I thought that was just Chagall. Wow, you are a person of... You see Disney Hall behind you?
That's the Walt Disney Concert Hall.
It certainly is. How long have you been painting? You'll pan for that. I mean,
that was a whole new world. When I came to the Gardens, and a very fine teacher, Martha Saudick, started this art class. And I thought, well, that's a different thing to do. So I plopped myself down in the art class. And
you really did with both, all limbs.
most of these are places I've been. The picture down there with the flowers in it, those were my 90th birthday flowers. And if you notice, the picture behind them is a picture of Iris, and I'll show you the full picture when we go upstairs. It's in one of our halls here.
Tell me about
this was New Zealand. This was the Big Island on Hawaii. This is our koi pond out here in front of the main building. And that was in Costa Rica. And the lady
in blue,
Indian lady up there was my Hopi pottery teacher. I went on a elder hostel, and there is one of my Hopi pottery pieces.
Tell me about the Chagall that you did.
Oh, that's a copy.
But you did that, though.
I did.
It's brilliant.
Copied it.
It's just, wow. You have such. You're going to be 100 next year. How do you do this? What are your tips?
Keep doing different things. You know, like I decided about the time I'm the one that went on 15 international bicycle trips and took up cross-country skiing when I was about 80, I guess. I don't know. Keep trying things, and you might find something good.
Wow.